The ocean is a deep, mysterious place, home to many strange creatures and phenomena. It's also home to a lot of trash, which is why we created a 10-minute documentary about it called The Human Element. But today's story isn't about any of that. Instead, let's talk about something beautiful that happens in the ocean, the birth of an island. There are hundreds of islands in the world that were formed by the same process. And the conditions for this process are pretty simple. You need a volcano, a little bit of magic, some water, and a really long time. I'm talking tens of thousands of years here. These islands start out as underwater volcanoes. They puff up from the ocean floor and grow until they poke their peaks above the surface. Then Mother Nature takes over and starts eroding the tops of these mountains down until they look like normal islands. Sometimes she even throws in some sand to help things along. These magical floating chunks of rock are known as guyots, or raised coral atolls. A famous example is the island of Mauritius, which is home to around 1.3 million people and was formed by this very process. Fun fact, Mauritius was once a part of India before it broke off due to tectonic plate movement. Now it's just drifting off to the east, moving about 3 centimeters per year. Madagascar is also made up of ancient underwater volcanoes. In fact, one of them is so old it actually eroded back into the sea, and now there's a lagoon where the mountain used to be. But all of these islands are doomed to disappear again because the ocean doesn't like sharing its toys. Eventually, each of these islands will sink back beneath the waves, never to be seen again. But not all lost islands are created equal. Some might sink entirely, while others only partially submerge. Others still are completely covered with water, except for a single coral head poking through the surface like a shark's tooth. This final form is what makes today's story unique. It's the story of an island that sank so slowly it became a tourist attraction. That's right, people would go on pilgrimages to see the island while it was sinking. The sinking island was located in the Maldives, a country in South Asia that consists of 26 atolls and hundreds of smaller islands. When people think of the Maldives, they think of luxury resorts and white sand beaches. But under the Indian Ocean, things are much darker. The entire country sits on the edge of a tectonic plate known as the Indian Plate, which is slowly but surely bumping into another plate called the Eurasian Plate. As these two plates collide, the land they are carrying along for the ride is being pushed down into the ocean. Even though the Himalayas are rising up on the other side of the continent, the Maldives are literally going the opposite direction and inching closer to the ocean. Now, if the ocean could speak, it would definitely say something like, "Oh, please get out of my way." But since the ocean can't speak, it's instead doing something much more sinister. It's getting warmer. As the Indian Plate dives deeper and deeper into the ocean, it's exposing the ocean water to higher and higher levels of heat and pressure. And we all know what happens when you raise the temperature on seawater. It turns into warm water, and that's bad news for the Maldives. As the ocean gets warmer, it will expand, causing sea levels to rise and swallowing the Maldives whole. Some scientists estimate that the Maldives could be completely submerged within the next century. So with the writing on the wall, it's time for us to meet our protagonist, a small island named Goidhoo. Goidhoo was born from an underwater volcano that erupted sometime in the last 200,000 years, and then spent several thousand years growing and shrinking with the rest of the island chain. During its lifetime, the island hosted at least 3 distinct human settlements, all of which chose to abandon ship when the ocean started rising. But Goidhoo wasn't done yet. It had a few more centuries left to live. When Europeans first arrived in the Maldives, they noticed something strange. One of the islands was missing. They searched and searched, but the island seemed to have vanished without a trace. All they found was a lone coral head poking through the water and the memory of a lost paradise. Or maybe they didn't find anything at all. Depending on who you ask, the Europeans either did or didn't find the island. Some accounts say they never found the island at all, and others claim that they found it and documented its location. When Europeans first arrived in the Maldives, they noticed something strange. One of the islands was missing. They searched and searched, but the island seemed to have vanished without a trace. All they found was a lone coral head poking through the water and the memory of a lost paradise. or maybe they didn't find anything at all. Depending on who you ask, the Europeans either did or didn't find the island. Some accounts say they never found the island at all, and others claim that they found it and documented its location. Either way, there was a race to find the island. European powers raced around the ocean, trying to find the island that was either there or not. Britain ended up winning this bizarre competition by finding the island first. They claimed the island for itself, and built a lighthouse on top of the coral head to warn passing ships of the rocks below. They also stationed soldiers on the island to protect it from other European powers. But it wasn't much of a challenge. There was no one else to protect it from. No one else wanted the island because it was dying. By the early 20th century, the island was barely above the water. It was completely surrounded by a shallow lagoon. Its lighthouse was dismantled and shipped off to another island. By the 1930s, the island was completely underwater and the search was over, but the legend of the island lived on. People started visiting the Maldives just to see the island that sank. Many of them were disappointed to learn that there was nothing to see. After all, it was an underwater island. What did they expect? But some people actually saw the island. How? Well, it depends on who you ask. One version claims that after the island sank, a hermit crab crawled up the coral head to lay its eggs. Then a coconut tree grew out of the island, creating a small oasis for birds to rest on their travels. Finally, a fisherman paddled out to the island to collect coconuts, and that's how people saw the island. Well, not exactly. It's a bit of local flavor added to attract tourists. The truth is that the island was seen by fishermen and locals for decades, even after it sank. This may seem impossible, but it's actually pretty common. Islands sink at different rates depending on where they are and how big they are. Most of the time, islands sink quickly enough that we don't notice, but sometimes we do. The truth is that the island was seen by fishermen and locals for decades, even after it sank. This may seem impossible, but it's actually pretty common. Islands sink at different rates depending on where they are and how big they are. Most of the time, islands sink quickly enough that we don't notice, but sometimes we do. One of the most famous examples is the island of Heimaey in Iceland, which sank between 1364 and 1965. Over the course of those 600 years, the island shrank from 700 meters high to only 25 meters above the water. The islanders watched their land disappear beneath the waves, sometimes losing as much as 20 centimeters in a single day. Of course, they weren't completely helpless. They tried everything they could to save their homes, building seawalls and pumping water out of the harbor to keep the island afloat. But eventually they had to abandon their island and move to the mainland. Most of the time, these stories end with people losing their homes and their way of life. But sometimes people win. Such was the case with the people who visited the island of Goidhoo. Because even though the island was completely underwater, its peak was only 24 meters below the surface, so it was easy to spot from passing boats. People would make the pilgrimage to see the island, and even take snorkeling trips to see the coral head up close and personal. The people who made these trips usually brought back souvenirs like shells or pebbles, but some were less honest and stole coral from the island to sell to unsuspecting tourists. Eventually, word got out that the island was being robbed and looting became illegal. But by that point, the damage was already done. By the 1980s, the island was completely underwater, and no one was left to protect it. But that didn't stop people from trying to steal it. In 2004, a group of Japanese businessmen tried to buy the island from the Maldivian government, but their offer was refused. They weren't giving up though. And in 2006, they bought an abandoned island near Goidhoo to use as a base for their operations. Their plan was to fill in the shallow lagoon surrounding Goidhoo, turning it into a new island that they could develop for tourism. But the Maldivian government found out about their plan and intervened, forcing the Japanese businessmen to abandon their scheme. This is probably for the best. If the Japanese businessmen had succeeded, it would have been a tragedy for the island and for everyone involved. There's something special about places like this, a beauty that comes from their transience, a reminder that nothing lasts forever. If the island had been turned into a tourist trap, it would have lost its charm and become just another luxury resort. Today, no one knows exactly where the island is. Maybe it's still there, hidden beneath the waves. Or maybe it's gone forever. Either way, the legend lives on, a reminder that even islands eventually sink. But not all lost islands are created equal. Some might sink entirely, while others only partially submerge. Others still are completely covered with water except for a single coral head poking through the surface.